I still remember the exact moment the foundation of my life started to crack, even though, at the time, I couldn't possibly explain the sudden, sharp chill that ran down my spine. It was late October, one of those distinctly bitter Midwest evenings where the fading daylight casts long, bruised shadows, and the crisp air is thick with the scent of wet, decaying leaves and distant chimney smoke. My husband, James, had been wearing a trench into the hardwood floor of our kitchen all afternoon. I was sitting nearby at the dining room table, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee and trying to power through a seemingly endless inbox of work emails. Our house felt vast and uncomfortably hollow without his son, Connor, around. I had just assumed the quiet was due to Connor's demanding senior year college schedule, keeping him sequestered on campus. Finally, James stopped his relentless pacing. He let out a long, ragged exhale and leaned his heavy hands flat against the granite countertop. His shoulders slumped with exhaustion. "I've got a flight out to Denver tomorrow morning," he announced, his voice tight. I looked up from the glowing screen of my laptop, my brow furrowing for the regional conference. He nodded, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Yeah, they bumped the whole schedule up at the absolute last minute. Corporate wants me on the ground early to prep the executive team." I suppressed a sigh, gently closing my laptop. James's job had been demanding more and more of his time lately, pulling him away for weeks on end. "Well, okay," I said, forcing a supportive smile. "Don't worry about things here. I'll hold down the fort." Then he hesitated. It was just a fraction of a second, a slight shifting of his weight. But looking back, that fleeting hesitation was the very first microscopic fracture in everything that followed. "Actually," he added, his hand drifting to rub the back of his neck, a nervous tic he'd had since the day I met him, "I was wondering if you could do me a massive favor and help Connor out." I frowned, genuinely confused. "Help him with what? He has got that big job interview up in Chicago on Thursday, remember?" "Right." I searched my memory, vaguely recalling a dinner conversation from a week prior, where Connor had mumbled something between bites of roast chicken. Some high-level marketing internship with a big downtown firm. "Yeah," I said slowly, tracing the rim of my coffee mug. "So what does he need?" A suit pressed. "A pep talk." James exhaled again, this time sounding like a man who had been wrestling with a heavy burden all day. "He doesn't have a reliable car right now, and last minute flights out of the regional airport are astronomically expensive. I thought, maybe you could drive up with him tomorrow afternoon." I repeated, the word hanging heavy in the quiet kitchen. "It is really only a few hours away." I stared at him, incredulous. "James, from here to the Loop is like a 4-hour drive on a good day. Longer if we hit construction on I-55. 3.5 if traffic's moving," he corrected mildly, offering a weak, placating smile. I let out a breathy, cynical laugh. "You make it sound like we're just making a quick run to Target." But he kept looking at me with that painfully hopeful, earnest expression he always deployed when he needed a lifeline. "It is just for one night," he pleaded softly. "He has the interview bright and early Thursday morning, and then you guys can immediately turn around and come right back home." "And where exactly are we supposed to be staying?" I asked, crossing my arms over my chest. I already booked a hotel. That caught my full attention. My eyebrows shot up. "You already booked it?" He nodded, looking slightly guilty. "Yeah, 1 room, right downtown near the magnificent Mile. Nothing overly fancy, just a clean place to crash." Something inexplicable about the casual way he delivered that information made my stomach dip. "1 room?" I asked, my voice dropping a register. "2 beds," he added hastily, raising his hands in surrender. 2 separate queen beds, I promise." I stared at him in the fading afternoon light, turning the logistics over in my head. Connor was 22 years old now, technically a full-grown adult man, and I had been a constant fixture in his life for almost 8 years. I wasn't his biological mother, obviously. James and I had met roughly 2 years after his messy divorce, back when Connor was just an awkward, lanky 14-year-old trying to navigate high school. We had miraculously avoided that deeply cliché fade, toxic stepmother, Stepson tension that people love to joke about in movies. If anything, Connor had always been incredibly easy to be around. He was a quiet, fiercely intelligent, and respectful kid. Sometimes he was a little distant and moody, preferring the solitude of his headphones. But what teenage boy wasn't? I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping against the floor, and stood up. "Fine," I conceded, offering a small, resigned smile. "We'll pack some snacks and make a real road trip out of it." James's face lit up immediately, the relief washing over his features. "Thank you so much. Seriously, you are a lifesaver. You owe me a very expensive dinner when you get back from Denver," I warned him, pointing a finger. "Deal best steakhouse in town." At exact moment, wrapped in the warmth of my kitchen, with my grateful husband. It felt like nothing more than a harmless favor. It was a simple, mundane, overnight trip, the exact kind of inconvenient thing families happily do for one another. If someone had magically appeared in my kitchen then, and told me that this singular decision would completely irreparably unravel the fabric of my entire life, I would have laughed directly in their face. The following afternoon, Connor showed up at the front door with a faded canvas duffel bag slung effortlessly over his right shoulder. It still startled me sometimes to see just how much he had physically grown since his high school graduation. He was significantly taller than James now, with broad, athletic shoulders, a shock of perpetually messy dark brown hair, and those same calm, piercing blue eyes he had possessed since he was a kid. "Hey," he said casually, stepping into the foyer and bringing a rush of crisp autumn air in with him. "Hey yourself," I replied, grabbing my leather tote bag and car keys from the entryway table. "You ready for a grand Midwestern road trip?" He offered a small, crooked shrug, adjusting the strap of his bag. "As ready as I'll ever be, I guess." The drive started out remarkably normal. We hit the road around 2 in the afternoon, leaving the quiet suburbs behind. The interstate stretched out before us like an endless, hypnotic gray ribbon, cutting through miles of harvested cornfields and scattered, sleepy rural towns. The sky above was a heavy, unbroken slate gray, threatening rain that never seemed to fall, while a country radio station hummed quietly through the car's speakers. For the first solid hour or so, we simply fell into an easy rhythm, chatting about everyday things. We talked about his grueling final semester classes, the logistics of the upcoming interview, and the drama happening with his college roommates. I glanced over at him, keeping one hand steady on the steering wheel. "So, what kind of marketing work do you actually want to do once you are out of school?" "Honestly," he said, resting his elbow on the door and staring out the passenger window at the blurring trees, "I just want to land something that pays well enough so I can finally move out on my own and get a decent apartment." I chuckled. "Your dad might actually cry if you move too far away." There was a sharp, sudden hint of dark sarcasm in his tone that caught me off guard. But I decided not to press the issue. James's constant traveling had been a sore spot for Connor growing up, and I knew better than to pick at old scabs. Instead, I shifted gears. "Are you feeling nervous about the interview tomorrow?" "A little," he admitted, his voice softening. "You shouldn't be. You'll do great. You've got the grades for it." He slowly turned his head to look at me then, and for a split second, his gaze lingered just a fraction of a heartbeat longer than usual. The intensity in his blue eyes was heavy, almost searching. "Yeah," he said quietly, holding my gaze before finally looking back at the road. Another hour melted away. The structured conversation gradually dissolved into swapping random, funny stories and debating the merits of terrible fast food chains. At one point, he confidently took over the car's Bluetooth connection and started blasting the classic rock anthems James used to play at deafening volumes in our garage on Sunday afternoons. We eventually pulled off the highway at a sprawling, brightly lit gas station somewhere, just outside the Joliet city limits. Connor bought 2 massive energy drinks and a family-sized bag of jalapeno chips, while I desperately refilled my travel mug with mediocre, scalding black coffee. When we climbed back into the car, the late afternoon sun was already beginning its rapid descent, painting the bruised clouds in brilliant streaks of violet and burnt orange. "Are you absolutely sure you are okay with sharing a hotel room?" he asked abruptly, snapping open the tab of his energy drink. The suddenness of the question caught me totally off guard. I paused, my hands resting on the steering wheel before putting the car in drive. "Why wouldn't I be? I mean," he shrugged, taking a long sip and looking straight ahead. "It is just kind of weird, isn't it?" I smirked, shaking my head as I pulled back onto the interstate. "Connor, relax. Your dad made sure there are 2 completely separate beds. It is not like we're going to be sharing blankets or fighting over pillows." He chuckled softly, a low rumble in his chest, but he didn't say anything else for the remainder of the drive. We finally hit the outer edges of Chicago around 7 o'clock. The downtown traffic was its usual, soul-crushing nightmare. A chaotic symphony of blaring horns, an endless sea of glaring red brake lights, and aggressive pedestrians darting across slick pavement like they had absolute death wishes. By the time I managed to navigate the labyrinth of one-way streets and pulled up to the valet stand of our hotel, the muscles in my neck and shoulders were screaming with tension. The building itself was a stunning, modern glass monolith, deeply nestled among high-end steakhouses and glowing neon theater signs. Inside, the expansive lobby was an oasis of calm, smelling faintly of rich mahogany polish, fresh lilies, and expensive, subtle perfume. Connor stood off to the side, lingering near the gleaming brass elevator banks with our bags, while I handled the check in at the marble front desk. "I have you confirmed for a room with 2 queens," the impeccably dressed receptionist stated smoothly as she slid 2 electronic key cards across the counter. "Perfect. Thank you." We rode the glass, paneled elevator silently up to the 11th floor. The long, carpeted hallway was eerily quiet, save for the muffled, indistinct hum of distant televisions bleeding through heavy wooden doors. When I finally swiped the key card and pushed open the door to our room, a massive wave of relief washed over me. It was spacious and immaculate. 2 large plush beds sat opposite a sleek modern desk, and a massive floor-to-ceiling window offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the glittering Chicago skyline. "Nice setup," Connor remarked, casually tossing his heavy duffel bag onto the bed, situated closest to the window. "Hey, I call the other one," I joked, dropping my tote bag onto the mattress near the bathroom door. He smirked, a genuine, easy smile lighting up his face. "Fair enough." After taking a few minutes to decompress and splash water on our faces, we ventured back out into the bitter cold, walking a few brisk blocks to grab a late dinner at a loud, dimly lit, casual bar and grill. We kept it incredibly simple: massive bacon cheeseburgers, a mountain of truffle fries, and a couple of local draft beers. Away from the quiet confinement of the car and the hotel, Connor seemed to loosen up tremendously. He animatedly told hilarious, disastrous stories about wild fraternity parties, ruthlessly graded economics exams, and a parade of eccentric, filthy college roommates who apparently refused to wash a single dish. I found myself laughing harder and more genuinely that night than I had in months. By the time we paid the tab and began the walk back to the hotel, the city streets were fully alive, buzzing with frantic weekend energy, despite it being a Wednesday. Heavy bass music drifted out of the open doors of crowded dive bars, taxi horns blared incessantly, and the legendary biting Chicago wind cut mercilessly through the narrow concrete canyons between the skyscrapers. When we finally made it back to the serene warmth of our room, I practically kicked off my leather boots and collapsed backward onto the crisp white duvet of my bed, groaning. God, my lower back is absolutely killing me. It was a long drive, Connor noted sympathetically, shrugging off his heavy jacket. Yeah, definitely feeling my age tonight. He grabbed a change of clothes and disappeared into the bathroom to take a shower, while I pulled out my phone and blindly scrolled through my notifications. James had texted around 10 o'clock, made it to Denver safe. Flight was bumpy. Everything okay on your end? I quickly typed back. Yeah, traffic was brutal, but we're settled at the hotel. Connor's interview is tomorrow morning. Good. I am really proud of him. Me too, I replied, adding a small heart emoji before locking the screen. About 15 minutes later, the bathroom door swung open, allowing a thick cloud of warm, damp steam to drift lazily into the bedroom. Connor stepped out wearing a pair of dark gray sweatpants and a loose, faded vintage t-shirt, his messy hair still visibly damp and sticking to his forehead. Bathroom's all yours, he said, tossing his damp towel onto a nearby chair. I grabbed my neatly folded pajamas and retreated into the bathroom. I stood under the scalding hot spray of the shower for a long time, letting the water brutally massage the tight, aching knots out of my shoulders. For a few blissful minutes, wrapped in the steam, I felt completely grounded and normal again. I was just a tired, dedicated stepmom executing a simple, quick overnight favor for her husband. Nothing more. When I emerged, fully dressed for bed and vigorously drying my hair, Connor was sitting rigidly on the edge of his mattress. The main overhead lights were off, and he was staring intently at something on his glowing phone screen. The large flat-screen television mounted on the wall was playing a late-night talk show on a barely audible volume. "Are you setting an alarm on your phone?" I asked, tossing my damp towel onto the desk chair. "Yeah. The interview is at 9 sharp, so I need to be up by 7. Good plan." I climbed under the heavy, cool blankets of my bed and reached over to click off the brass reading lamp on the nightstand. The room instantly dimmed, plunged into shadow, save for the erratic, soft, flickering glow of the muted television and the distant city lights outside. "Night, Connor," I said, pulling the duvet up to my chin. "Night," he replied softly. For a long while, the room was steeped in a heavy, peaceful quiet. The only sounds were the muffled, rhythmic hum of late night traffic moving far below us, and the occasional, restless rustling of Connor shifting his weight under his sheets. Exhaustion pulled at my limbs, and I must have dozed off, slipping into a deep, dreamless sleep. But sometime, much later, I woke up with a sudden, violent jolt. My heart was hammering against my ribs, though at first, my sleep, fogged brain couldn't process why. The room was deathly still. Then, as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I noticed the pale, ghostly light emanating from Connor's phone. It was illuminating his face in stark relief across the dark expanse of the room. He wasn't lying down. He was sitting bolt upright in his bed, his back resting against the headboard, staring directly, unblinkingly, across the space between us at me. And when my heavy, tired eyes finally met his in the darkness, he didn't flinch. He didn't casually look away or pretend to be staring at the wall. Not right away. For a deeply disorienting moment, I convinced myself I was trapped in a hyper-realistic dream state. The room was shrouded in darkness, except for that cold, pale blue wash of digital light, which cast deep, shifting shadows across his jawline and made his expression incredibly difficult to read. But his eyes were undeniably fixed on me. It wasn't a vacant, exhausted stare. It was focused, locked. It was the kind of intense, predatory gaze that makes the tiny hairs on the back of your neck stand on end and triggers a primal warning bell in your mind. Connor, I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly loud and raspy in the silence. He blinked slowly, almost as if he were physically dragging himself out of a deep, hypnotic trance. Sorry, he murmured, his voice low and gravelly. He lowered the phone slightly, resting it on his knee. Did I wake you up a little? I pushed myself up onto my left elbow, aggressively rubbing my eyes and desperately trying to shake off that heavy, disorienting fog that clings to you when you are pulled from deep REM sleep. What time is it? Almost midnight. I glanced past him toward the massive window. The vibrant, glittering tapestry of the Chicago city lights spilled aggressively through the glass, looking like an upside-down field of stars. You really should try to get some sleep, I advised gently, maternal instinct kicking in. You have a massive day tomorrow. Yeah, I know, but he didn't move. He didn't slide down under the covers or turn his phone off. He just stayed sitting there, completely rigid, for another long, agonizing second. Then he asked something that effectively shattered the fragile quiet of the room. Can I ask you something? His voice was perfectly calm, level, but there was a strange, vibrating tension thrumming just beneath the surface that I couldn't quite identify or place. Sure, I said slowly, a slight knot forming in my stomach. He hesitated, his thumb tracing the edge of his phone case. Then he asked, Are you actually happy with my dad? The deeply personal question felt completely inappropriate and bizarre coming out of nowhere in the middle of the night. I frowned slightly, my protective walls instantly going up. Why in the world would you ask me something like that? He offered a non-committal shrug, though the physical movement looked stiff and entirely forced. I am just curious. I let out a breath and leaned back heavily against my stack of pillows, pulling the duvet tighter around my waist. Well, yes, of course I am. He didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched, pulling taut like a rubber band about to snap. You really don't sound very convinced, he noted quietly after a long moment. I let out a short, dismissive, quiet laugh. That is probably because it is midnight and I am currently half asleep, Connor. He offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile at that. But once again, he made absolutely no move to lie down. Something about the thick, suffocating silence hanging in the space between our beds started to feel incredibly heavy, almost dangerous. Are you feeling nervous about the interview? I asked, desperately attempting to forcefully shift the mood back to safe, neutral territory. A little bit, he admitted, looking down. You are going to do great. You are incredibly smart. You've got stellar grades, and you are naturally good with people. Thanks. He stared down at his large hands resting in his lap for a long, quiet moment. Then he slowly lifted his gaze back to mine. You've always been really nice to me since day one. That sudden shift to earnestness made me smile genuinely. Well, that is usually the overarching goal when you become part of a family. Not everyone actually does it, though. I tilted my head slightly, my brow furrowing in sympathy. Does your mom? He exhaled sharply through his nose, a bitter sound. Yeah, she tries, but that is a completely different dynamic. I didn't dare push any further. I was intimately aware that his relationship with his biological mother had been fractured and deeply complicated ever since the messy fallout of the divorce. Another long, heavy stretch of silence passed between us, filled only by the muted glow of the television commercial. Then Connor suddenly shifted, swinging his long legs over the side of his mattress. For a split second, I logically assumed he was finally getting up to grab a drink of water or use the bathroom, but instead, his bare feet hit the carpet, and he just stood there beside his bed, tall and still, his eyes never leaving mine. What are you doing? I asked, my voice betraying a hint of sudden nervousness. Just stretching my legs, he replied smoothly. But he wasn't stretching. He just stood there like a statue. Then, with deliberate, slow steps, he walked a few paces toward the massive window, turning his profile to me as he glanced out over the sprawling, glowing city, as if he were deeply contemplating a complex math problem. I watched him warily for a moment, my mind still thick and foggy with residual sleep, desperately trying to compute the strange energy in the room. "Connor, you should really try to force yourself to sleep," I urged again, my tone firmer. "Your brain is going to need to be sharp tomorrow." "Yeah." He turned away from the glass, pivoting slowly back toward me. And that was the precise moment something fundamental shifted in the atmosphere of the room. It was incredibly subtle, yet terrifyingly undeniable. The specific way he was looking down at me suddenly didn't feel like the familiar, safe, quiet Connor I had helped raise and known for the better part of a decade. His gaze lingered, way too long. It was heavy, calculating, like he was meticulously studying me under a microscope. Like he was trying to desperately read a hidden code written across my face. I felt a small, icy knot of genuine unease violently twist deep in my stomach. "Is everything okay?" I asked, pulling the blanket slightly higher. "Yeah," he answered softly. Then he added in a near whisper, I keep thinking about things tonight." "Like what?" He hesitated, his jaw flexing. Then he said something that made my chest tighten in a way that made it hard to draw breath, like how things might have been totally different. I asked, my voice barely above a breath, "If you had met me before you ever met my dad." The words left his mouth and hung suspended in the chilled air of the hotel room, like a fragile glass ornament that had just been dropped, waiting for the devastating sound of the shatter. For a wild, desperate second, I tried to convince myself I had simply misheard him through the sleep fog. "What?" I said sharply. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking suddenly, painfully embarrassed. "Never mind. Forget it. It was a stupid, dumb thought." "No," I commanded, immediately sitting up straighter against the headboard, all traces of sleep completely vanishing from my system. "What exactly did you mean by that, Connor?" He let out a long, heavy sigh and leaned his broad shoulders back against the wall, adjacent to the window. "I was just thinking," he mumbled, staring at the floor. "If you had met me when I was older, like I am now." I stared at him, my mind racing to catch up to the horrifying implication. And maybe things would have been completely different. My heartbeat picked up a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. "Connor," I said carefully, meticulously choosing my words like I was trying to defuse a live bomb, "I met your father almost a full decade ago. I know. You were only 14 years old." "Yeah, I was." I waited in agonizing silence for him to laugh the whole thing off, to wave his hands, and say he meant something entirely innocent about family dynamics. But he didn't. Instead, he locked eyes with me and said quietly, with terrifying conviction, "You are honestly not that much older than me." That sentence landed on my chest like a bucket of freezing ice water. I felt my entire body go completely rigid, paralyzed by a sudden intense spike of adrenaline. "Okay," I said slowly, forcefully injecting authority into my voice. "I think you are extremely tired and your brain is wandering. I am dead serious." My voice sharpened into a blade. "And I am telling you right now that this conversation is getting incredibly weird and inappropriate. For a terrible, breathless second, neither of us." The tension was suffocating. Then he slowly raised his right hand in a placating surrender gesture. "I am sorry." He took a deliberate step backward, retreating toward the safety of his own bed. "I really didn't mean to make it weird for you." "Good," I snapped, desperately trying to keep the frantic tremor out of my tone, "because it is incredibly weird." He sat down heavily on the edge of his mattress once again. The thick, unresolved tension in the small room lingered in the air like heavy static electricity right before a lightning strike. After a long agonizing moment, he spoke again, his voice painfully quiet. "I swear I wasn't trying to disrespect you. I know you weren't, and I would never, ever do anything to actively hurt my dad. I know that too, Connor, but the horrifying truth was, I suddenly had absolutely no idea what to think anymore." The boy I had known intimately for 8 years had always been polite, painfully reserved, and almost shy. This terrifying, intense version of him sitting feet away from me in the dark felt entirely alien. He was intense, hyper, aware, and dangerously bold. I aggressively yanked the duvet up to my shoulders. "Let's just go to sleep, please," I pleaded. "Yeah, okay," he agreed softly. He finally lay back on his bed, the springs groaning softly, and clicked the lock button on his phone. The room was plunged into near, total darkness, saved only by the distant, muted glow of the city filtering through the glass. I aggressively closed my eyes and commanded myself to relax. I desperately tried to rationalize what had just happened. I tried to forcefully convince my racing mind that it had just been a strange, delirious, late-night string of thoughts brought on by severe exhaustion and interview anxiety. Nothing more, but my brain absolutely refused to shut down. The silence was deafening. His specific, loaded words kept replaying on a terrifying, endless loop in my mind. "If you had met me when I was older, you are not that much older than me." The longer I lay there agonizing over the implications, the more deeply physically uncomfortable I felt. My skin crawled. Eventually, unable to handle the vulnerability of lying flat, I rolled forcefully onto my left side, turning my back entirely to his side of the room. Agonizing minutes slowly ticked by, maybe 30 minutes, maybe an entire hour. Just as I finally felt the heavy, numbing pull of exhaustion dragging me back down towards action, it was the distinct, quiet creak of mattress springs, shifting weight. Then the nearly silent, padded thud of bare footsteps on the hotel carpet. My eyes snapped open instantly, wide and unblinking in the dark. I stayed completely paralyzed, holding my breath, listening with terrifying intensity. The muffled footsteps stopped, and they stopped terrifyingly close to my bed. A split second later, his voice floated down through the darkness, pitched barely above a trembling whisper. "I can't stop thinking about you." Me heart violently slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. I slowly, agonizingly turned my head over my shoulder. Connor was standing right beside my bed, towering in the darkness. For a fleeting, desperate second, my brain tried to convince me I had imagined the voice. The room was so dark, and my eyes were still straining to adjust. But as the seconds ticked by, I could clearly make out his massive silhouette standing directly over the edge of the mattress. He was standing so incredibly close that if I simply reached out my hand in the dark, my fingertips would brush the fabric of his sweatpants. Panic and adrenaline surged through my veins. "What did you just say?" I demanded, my voice trembling but harsh. He didn't move an inch. He stood there like a monolith, I said. "I can't stop thinking about you." There was no nervous, deflecting laugh. There was no joking, teasing lilt to his tone. There was nothing but a raw, terrifyingly calm honesty that made the oxygen in the room feel incredibly heavy and hard to breathe. Acting entirely on instinct, I forcefully pushed myself upright, frantically pulling the heavy blanket tight against my chest. "Like a physical shield, Connor," I said, my voice dropping into a harsh, authoritative command. "You need to turn around and go back to your bed right now." He exhaled slowly, a long, shuddering breath, almost as if he had been physically holding those words trapped inside his lungs for a lifetime. "I've been desperately trying to ignore it," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "Stop talking. I mean it. I've been trying to kill it for years." That single word made the bottom drop entirely out of my stomach. "Years," I repeated, horrified. I saw the dark silhouette of his head nod slowly in the gloom. Since high school, my brain violently rejected the information, struggling to process the timeline. "You were a literal child," I gasped, horrified. "I am not a kid anymore. That is entirely beside the point." I forcefully swung my legs over the opposite side of the bed and stood up abruptly, desperate to put physical distance between us. The stiff hotel carpet felt icy cold beneath my bare feet. My hands were shaking. "Listen to me," I commanded, struggling to keep my voice steady and reasonable. "You are exhausted. You are completely overwhelmed and nervous about this massive interview tomorrow. Your brain is short-circuiting and mixing up wires." He slowly shook his head side to side. "Number, it is not." "Yes, it is. I know exactly what I am saying, and I tightly crossed my arms over my chest, suddenly feeling terribly exposed in my thin pajamas. "This behavior is incredibly inappropriate. I know it is, and it has to stop instantly. Right now." He looked down at the dark floor between us for a long, heavy moment, then slowly brought his gaze back up to meet mine. "I figured you would say exactly that, because it is the safe, obvious, expected answer. But you saying that doesn't magically change how I actually feel." "That doesn't matter," I hissed, trying to keep my voice low so it didn't carry through the thin hotel walls. His jaw tightened, a hard line visible, even in the dark. "It matters to me." I aggressively rubbed my throbbing temples with the heels of my hands, desperately trying to slow down the frantic, terrifying racing of my thoughts. "Connor, look at me. I am legally married to your father. I know you are. I have been a parental figure in your life since you were 14 years old. I know that too. Then you should easily understand why this entire conversation is completely, fundamentally unacceptable." He finally took a slow, deliberate step backward, almost as if he suddenly realized how deeply he was crowding my physical space. "I am not trying to physically force anything on you," he said quietly, his voice breaking slightly. "Good. I felt like I was going insane. Once you never should have. Maybe not." The ensuing silence between us felt incredibly violent, thick enough to choke on. I nervously darted my eyes toward the heavy wooden door leading out to the hallway, mentally calculating my exit strategy if things escalated, then forced my gaze back to him. "You need to go back to your bed. Right now." He stared at me for another agonizing few seconds, his chest rising and falling heavily. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Okay." For a brief, relieved moment, I foolishly thought that was the absolute end of the nightmare. He turned his broad back to me and slowly walked across the dark room. The faint, ambient city light caught the sharp outline of his shoulders. He sat down heavily on his mattress. I remained standing exactly where I was, frozen by the bed, my heart still hammering in my ears, making absolutely sure he stayed put. When he finally lay back down and pulled the sheets up, I let out a shaky breath and slowly climbed back into my own bed, pulling the covers defensively up to my neck. But sleep was entirely impossible now. My mind was a chaotic, spinning centrifuge, violently replaying every single word he had just confessed. Since high school, the sheer magnitude of that statement made me physically nauseous. I couldn't even begin to wrap my logical mind around it. Had I completely missed obvious, glaring signs over the years? Had there been specific, isolated moments where his behavior was inappropriately intense, and I had just naively brushed it off as teenage awkwardness? The sickening thought made my chest ache. The absolute last thing I wanted in the world was to look back at our history and horrifyingly realize I had somehow unknowingly nurtured or encouraged this twisted obsession. The room remained deathly quiet for a long time. Eventually, as my breathing slowly regulated, I naively thought maybe the worst of the tension had finally broken. Maybe he had just reached a boiling point, needed to painfully get the horrific secret off his chest. and now the delusion would rapidly fade away into deep embarrassment in the morning light. Then, after what felt like an eternity of staring at the dark ceiling, his voice cut through the silence again. It was incredibly soft, almost tentative. "Can I ask you just one more thing?" I forcefully squeezed my eyes shut in sheer, exhausted frustration. "Connor, please. I swear I'll drop the whole thing forever after this." I slowly turned my head toward the dark mass of his bed. "What?" I snapped, my patience completely gone. There was a long, pregnant pause before he finally spoke. "Have you honestly ever felt unhappy being married to my dad?" The audacity of the repeated question irritated me on a cellular level. "That is absolutely none of your business, Connor. Maybe it is not, but what?" I demanded sharply. "But sometimes people force themselves to stay in comfortable relationships that aren't actually working for them anymore." My fragile patience snapped completely in two. "James and I are perfectly fine. You hesitated earlier today in the kitchen. I hesitated because your father sprang a 4-whore last minute road trip on me while I was trying to work." I shot back, keeping my voice in a harsh whisper. He was quiet again, letting my anger absorb into the room. Then he calmly said something that made my chest tighten in a completely different, deeply uncomfortable way. "He travels constantly." "Yes, he does. He is physically gone way more than he is ever home. That is the nature of his corporate job. Connor, you spend a lot of quiet, lonely nights completely by yourself in that massive house." The empathetic, knowing way he delivered that observation made the hair on my arms prickle uncomfortably. He was seeing a vulnerability in my marriage that I hadn't even fully admitted to myself. "That still doesn't make this conversation okay, in any reality," I stated coldly. "I know it doesn't." "Then stop doing it." He let out a sad, heavy sigh that rustled his sheets. You deserve to be with someone who actually pays attention to you. Someone who sees you." My voice dropped to absolute zero, practically dripping with ice. "Enough. I am serious. I absolutely do not care if you are serious. Do not speak about my marriage again." The room crashed back into a heavy, suffocating silence. For a long, terrifying moment, I braced myself, fully expecting him to push the boundary even further, but he did. Finally, the silence was broken by a single, incredibly quiet word. "I am sorry." That specific apology actually sounded raw and genuine, stripped of all the earlier intensity. My adrenaline spiked and dropped, leaving me utterly hollow and exhausted. I turned forcefully onto my right side, facing away from him once again, staring at the dark wall. "Go to sleep," I ordered firmly. Yeah, this time the heavy silence that followed lasted for the rest of the agonizing night. Eventually, the chaotic city noise outside the glass softened into a dull roar. The erratic taxi traffic thinned out. The distant wail of emergency sirens faded into nothingness. Somewhere around 3:30 in the morning, completely drained by adrenaline and anxiety, I finally drifted into a shallow, feverish, restless sleep plagued by disjointed dreams. When my eyes finally fluttered open again, pale, watery morning sunlight was aggressively creeping through the slight gap in the heavy blackout curtains. For a brief, disorienting second, I had absolutely no idea where I was. Then, like a physical blow to the head, every horrific detail of the night rushed back into my conscious mind. The long drive, the hotel room, the confession. Connor. I slowly, cautiously sat up, the duvet falling away from my chest. I looked across the room. His bed was already empty, the sheets hastily pulled up. My heart skipped a violent beat. The bathroom door was cracked open, revealing pitch blackness, completely silent. But a second later, I heard the distinct mechanical click of the small, cheap coffee machine sitting on the desk in the corner. Connor was standing casually by the small wooden counter near the massive window, meticulously pouring steaming, dark coffee into two flimsy paper cups. He was already fully dressed, and his expression looked completely, terrifyingly calm, as if the earth-shattering confrontation of the previous night had simply never happened. "Morning," he said evenly, not looking up from the cups. I openly stared at him, my brain completely unsure of how to navigate the surreal morning light. "Morning." He calmly walked over and extended one of the hot paper cups toward me. "Figured you might desperately want this." "Thanks," I muttered cautiously. As I reached out to take the cup, my cold fingers briefly brushed against his warm knuckles. The fleeting electric contact made me instantly hyper, aware of exactly how incredibly close he was standing to my bed again. He must have sensed it, because he stepped backward immediately, giving me space. "My interview is in exactly 2 hours," he stated briskly, checking the silver watch on his wrist. Another agonizing, painfully awkward silence rapidly filled the hotel room. I took a tentative sip of the bitter black coffee, hoping the caffeine would clear my foggy brain. Then, he calmly said something that made my stomach violently twist all over again. "About last night, I meant absolutely every single word I said." I snapped my head up, glaring at him over the rim of the paper cup. "And you still never should have said any of it." He slowly nodded, his expression unreadable. "You are probably right. I probably shouldn't have." He paused, taking a slow sip of his own coffee, before adding in a quiet, devastatingly calm voice. "But honestly, the absolute worst part about all of this is, I am pretty sure you already knew." For a confusing, disorienting second, my exhausted brain couldn't even process the sequence of his words. I just sat there frozen, sitting up in a strange hotel bed, tightly holding a burning hot paper cup, while his terrifying accusation hung suspended in the bright morning air between us. "But the worst part is, I think you already knew." I stared at him, my mouth slightly open. "What?" His calm, assessing expression didn't waver. "I think deep down, you already knew how I felt," he repeated softly. A sharp, genuinely bewildered, and defensive laugh violently escaped my throat before I could physically stop it. "No," I shot back immediately, my voice defensive and loud. "I absolutely did not." He tilted his head slightly to the left, his blue eyes meticulously studying every micro-expression on my face. "Are you seriously telling me you never noticed anything? Ever? Never. Not even once." I forcefully slammed the flimsy paper coffee cup down onto the nightstand, splashing a few dark drops onto the polished wood. "Connor, stop it right. I am literally just asking a question. And I am firmly telling you that the answer is a resounding no." My voice came out much sharper and firmer than I had anticipated. I sounded angry. I sounded incredibly convincing. But the terrifying, nauseating truth was that the precise moment he asked the horrible question, a swarm of tiny, seemingly insignificant memories began violently flashing through my brain, like a slideshow. Little innocent things I had easily dismissed or rationalized away over the years. The specific, intense way he sometimes held unbroken eye contact with me, just a fraction of a second too long at the dinner table. The strange, eager way he consistently materialized out of thin air, always ready to help me with heavy chores around the house. The specific dark way his mood would instantly sour and withdraw whenever James and I had a minor, playful disagreement in front of him. At the time, living in the moment, it had all seemed completely harmless. He was just a helpful, slightly moody stepson. Now, viewed through this horrifying new lens, every memory felt deeply tainted, calculated, and terrifyingly different. "I didn't know," I stated again, my voice noticeably quieter, trembling slightly this time. Connor watched my face intently for another long, agonizing second. He saw the exact moment the realization hit my eyes. Okay, but the quiet, patronizing way he delivered the word made it terrifyingly clear that he absolutely did not believe me. I aggressively rubbed my temples, fighting a sudden, massive headache. We are absolutely not continuing this insane conversation. Fine, you have a massive career, defining interview in less than 2 hours. I know I do. And the second you walk out of that corporate building, we are getting directly into the car and driving straight home. Yeah, understood. He casually picked up his coffee cup and calmly leaned his back against the desk. For a long, suffocating while, neither of us uttered a single sound. The bright morning sunlight violently pierced through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and filling the room with a pale, unforgiving light that made the entire terrifying situation feel horribly real, raw, and impossible to escape. Finally, unable to bear the silence and his unwavering gaze any longer, I forcefully grabbed my toiletry bag from the desk. I am going to take a shower. All right. I practically fled into the bathroom, shutting the heavy wooden door behind me with a loud, definitive click, and immediately engaging the lock. I violently cranked the heavy metal handle of the shower, letting the water run scalding hot, and heavily leaned both my trembling hands against the cold porcelain sink. I slowly looked up. My pale reflection in the brightly lit mirror looked completely destroyed, deeply exhausted, terrified, wildly stressed, and looking 10 years older than I had felt just 24 hours ago. I aggressively splashed cold water on my face and desperately tried to mentally box up the situation. I tried to firmly tell myself that the narrative was simple and controllable. Connor was a confused young man who had developed deeply inappropriate, displaced feelings that he never should have harbored. He had foolishly admitted them out loud in a moment of extreme weakness. I had immediately firmly shut it down like the responsible adult I was. That was it. The absolute end of the story. We would go home, and we would simply never speak of it again. But the terrifying, sinking problem in the pit of my stomach was that the situation didn't feel remotely finished. Because the intense, calculated way he had stared down at me in the darkness last night wasn't just a random, confused teenage confession. It had terrifying weight and gravity behind it. A decade of silent, building weight, apparently. The horrifying thought made my stomach violently twist and heave. The scalding shower eventually helped clear the panic from my head a little bit. I meticulously went through the motions of getting ready, applying my makeup with a steady hand. By the time I finally emerged back into the main room, fully dressed in a sharp sweater and jeans, Connor was entirely transformed. He was impeccably dressed in a crisp, light blue button-down shirt, a sharp navy blazer, and dark, fitted jeans. He looked exactly like a completely normal, ambitious 22-year-old college senior getting ready to conquer a corporate job interview. If a stranger walked into the hotel room right at that exact moment, they would never ever guess the psychological nightmare that had unfolded in this exact space, just a few short hours earlier. "Are you ready?" he asked casually, adjusting the cuff of his blazer. "Yeah, let's go." We quickly packed our bags, checked out of the room at the front desk in total silence, and walked out into the biting morning air. We had to walk 3 long city blocks to reach the massive, imposing corporate office building where his interview was scheduled. The wind whipping off Lake Michigan downtown was incredibly sharp, violent, and freezing cold. Hundreds of people rushed quickly past us on the wide sidewalks, completely bundled in heavy wool suits and thick coats, aggressively clutching hot coffees and leather briefcases. It was just a normal, bustling Wednesday morning in the city. Normal, chaotic life. When we finally reached the gleaming revolving glass doors of the massive corporate entrance, Connor abruptly stopped walking. He looked up at the towering glass facade. "Well, this is it," I nodded, wrapping my scarf tighter around my cold neck. "You are going to do great in there. Just be yourself." He hesitated for a long, awkward moment on the bustling sidewalk. Then he suddenly stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me in a hug. The sudden physical gesture shocked me so deeply, I momentarily froze. For years, that exact kind of quick, casual, one-armed embrace had been completely normal and expected between us at family gatherings or departures. But now, after the darkness of last night, every single point of physical contact felt incredibly radioactive and terrifyingly different. His strong arms wrapped tightly around my shoulders, and he held me against his chest for just a fraction of a second longer than was socially necessary or appropriate. Then, he smoothly stepped back, dropping his arms. "Wish me luck," he said, offering a small, tight smile. "Good luck." He turned on his heel and confidently walked through the revolving glass doors, instantly disappearing into the massive, echoing marble lobby of the building. The heavy glass doors rotated behind him, shutting him inside. I stood totally frozen on the freezing sidewalk for a long quiet, while after that, blindly watching the blur of faceless people aggressively pass me by, desperately trying to mentally slow the terrifying, violent storm of chaotic thoughts violently crashing inside my head. I sought refuge in a tiny, overpriced coffee shop down the street. I bought a tea I didn't want and sat in the corner booth, violently staring at the black screen of my phone, jumping every time someone opened the door. About 40 excruciating minutes later, my phone violently buzzed against the table. A text from Connor. "Interview is fully done." I blinked in surprise. That fast? Yeah. They liked me. I am walking out of the lobby right now. I grabbed my bag, tossed the untouched tea in the trash, and quickly walked back down the busy block. I looked up just as the heavy revolving doors deposited him back onto the cold sidewalk. He smoothly walked toward me with a completely blank, neutral expression that I couldn't quite read or decode. "Well?" I asked anxiously, my breath puffing white in the cold air. He offered a casual, confident shrug. "Honestly, I think it went really well. They seemed incredibly impressed with my portfolio." "That is genuinely great news." Connor, we immediately fell into step beside each other, beginning the long, freezing walk back toward the dimly lit, multi-level parking garage where I had left my SUV the night before. The conversation stayed intentionally light and superficial at first. I desperately asked rapid-fire questions about the specifics of the interview, the demeanor of the executives he had met, the layout of the corporate office. Totally normal, safe things, but I could physically feel something dark, massive, and entirely unspoken sitting heavily in the space between us as we walked, like an invisible third passenger dragging us. When we finally reached the concrete echo of the parking garage and located my car, I hit the unlock button on the key fob. The headlights flashed. Connor paused, his hand hovering heavily over the silver handle of the passenger door before finally opening it. He didn't get in immediately. Instead, he slowly turned his head over his shoulder and looked directly into my eyes across the roof of the car. "You are going to tell him everything that happened, aren't you?" he asked, his voice echoing slightly against the concrete walls. My chest violently tightened, my breath catching in my throat. "Your dad." "Yeah." I hesitated, my hand gripping my own door handle so hard my knuckles turned stark white, because the terrifying honest truth was, I hadn't firmly decided what I was going to do yet. Calling James right now and telling him the unvarnished truth would instantly, violently detonate a massive bomb in the center of our lives. It would completely, irreparably destroy the fragile, happy balance our blended family had miraculously built over 8 years. But keeping a secret this dark and massive felt exactly like trying to carry a live, ticking grenade in my pocket every single day. "I genuinely don't know," I admitted softly, the terrifying truth slipping out. Connor nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully, his blue eyes never leaving mine. "I guess that is entirely fair." Then, he calmly said something that made the floor completely drop out from beneath my feet. "If you do decide to finally tell him, just make absolutely sure you tell him the entire story." I heavily frowned, my heart rate spiking violently. He pulled the heavy passenger door open wider, but paused entirely before sliding his tall frame into the seat. He rested his forearm on the roof of the car. "It means," he said, his voice dropping into a quiet, terrifyingly intimate tone, "that I absolutely wasn't the only person wide awake in that room last night." Me heart physically violently skipped a beat, hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The concrete garage felt suddenly devoid of oxygen. "What the hell are you talking about, Connor?" He stared at me intensely for a long, heavy moment over the roof of the SUV. Then he delivered a sentence that hit me with the physical force of a brutal punch directly to the sternum. "You didn't pull away when I sat down on your bed." The terrifying memory violently slammed into my brain with sickening clarity. The specific, blurry moment, deep in the middle of the night, when I first jolted awake. The horrifying moment when he had already been sitting on the very edge of my mattress, not his own. The long, terrifying moment when I had still been completely, heavily half asleep, utterly disoriented in the pitch blackness. I had forcefully, desperately told myself earlier that morning that he was simply standing beside the bed when he made his horrific confession. But my brain had been lying to protect me. That wasn't the very first moment. There had been another moment entirely, a dark, terrifying, incredibly blurry moment, right when I first woke up and blearily saw his massive silhouette sitting heavily on the edge of my mattress, completely ruining the physical boundary between us, long before either of us had spoken a single word out loud. And for a few agonizing, terrifying seconds, in that heavy darkness, I hadn't moved an inch. I hadn't violently screamed. I hadn't forcefully pushed him away or kicked out. I hadn't even fully mentally processed what was actually happening in reality. Connor watched my horrified face carefully, meticulously tracking the dawning realization in my eyes. "You didn't say a single word to me," he continued, his voice terrifyingly calm, "and even you didn't tell me to leave. You just lay there, totally still, and looked up at me." The freezing air between us in the concrete garage felt suddenly, terrifyingly, thin and unbreathable. I was heavily half asleep. I shot back quickly, my voice trembling wildly with genuine panic. "I know you were. That moment doesn't mean absolutely anything." I never explicitly said that it did. He finally lowered his head and smoothly slid his large frame into the passenger seat of the SUV. But right before he pulled the heavy door completely shut, he paused, looking up at me through the gap one absolute last time. His blue eyes were piercing, calm, and terrifyingly certain. "Just don't ever stand there and pretend you didn't physically feel exactly how incredibly complicated that specific moment really was." The heavy car door slammed shut with a violent, echoing thud that rang through the entire concrete garage. I stood completely frozen outside the driver's side door of the car for what felt like an eternity, blindly staring forward through the tinted glass of the windshield. My hands were shaking so violently, I almost dropped the keys onto the oil-stained concrete. Because the sickening, horrifying truth was, I absolutely did remember that blurry, terrifying moment in the dark. I remembered the heavy weight of the mattress dipping under him. I remembered the heat radiating off his body. And the absolute worst part wasn't just the horrifying fact that the moment had physically happened. The worst, most destructive part was the sickening, soul-crushing realization that for one terrifyingly long split second, in the pitch blackness of that silent hotel room, I honestly hadn't been entirely sure what I wanted to do next.